Welcome to Voice Bootcamp, a global name in unified communication. Hello, my name is Faisal Khan, CEO and founder of voicebootcamp.com. In this series of CCNP CCIE Collaboration Self-Study Kit for Foundation, I'm going to discuss about the Cisco Meeting Server. Now, Cisco Meeting Server happens to be a solution from Cisco that can be used to provide audio, video, and web conferencing solutions for internal and external clients. It is formally known as a Kano server, which is an appliance that you can purchase or you can install them on Cisco UCS using virtual machine. Now, this particular server or solution can consist of multiple components, which you can of course pick and mix and depending on the type of environment that you have. For example, you can be a single server combined solutions or split solutions or highly redundant environment. Now, the deployment models that we have for Cisco Meeting Server, for example, you have single combined server deployment, single split server deployment, scalable and resiliency deployment. Now, you can use Cisco Meeting Server using and manage them from Telepresence Management Suite version 15.4 onward is supported. Now, using a meeting server, you can of course schedule a meeting from your Outlook using Exchange integration. You can use a web-based scheduling. You can use a TMS, Telepresence Management Suite interface to schedule your meeting, or you can use pretty much a few third-party integrations too. And of course, now you have to find out to make sure that the third-party tools that you're using do support the Cisco Meeting Server. Now, the first deployment model you have is called single combine. It's basically it says what it is. Single server it means one server running all the components that you need. It's limited to internal access and is used in a smaller environment where the scalability and redundancy limitation of a single server are not critical concern. In a situation where CMS can be probably mostly used for internal call manager conferencing. So in that environment, you may not need a high availability environment system. But if you do have external user who would like to conference in, then this may cause a limitation. So that's when you go and deploy the split version, the single split. Now, in single split, where you basically deploy an internal CMS as well as an external CMS, where it's basically called the Edge CMS server. Now, there are many different features that are supported environment where external client, for example, will connect to the external CMS server. Internal client will then use the internal CMS server, and then you can use Expressway to provide a secure connection between them. If you are going to use the Expressway server, then you don't need to define a dedicated edge for CMS. Scalable and resilience, redundancy for each component, so you could have multiple servers for each component. It allows for the system to grow with your needs to its maximum capacity, and of course it leverages the single edge concept to provide a secure external access. Now, what are the components of Cisco Meeting Server? There are many components that are working together. Not all components are required, of course. You can turn all of them on, or you can turn certain of these components on depending on what you need. So, for example, of course, the database is required. That allows some configurations such as dial plan, space, users to be aggregated. It supports clustering for high availability only in a single master concept. Call bridge is basically, of course, so your audio and video conferencing bridge. That is where the call will, of course, will be established to initiate a conference. So it basically provides a call control and media processing. Now, if you are going to use Cisco Meeting application, which is an app that allows you to join a meeting, then you must have XMPP server. This is basically used for registration and authentication. Cisco Meeting application or CMA, or any WebRTC client such as intercomponent signaling. Now, WebBridge, if you are going to use a WebRTC client, then you're going to need a WebBridge for WebRTC clients to connect to. Now, of course, for a web admin, which is a must because that is for your administration, API, and including CM ad-hoc conferencing as well. Now, for recording and streaming, call recording and streaming functionalities are also built into CMS. And optionally, if you are going to do a split deployment, then you may need a load balancer and a turn server. The major function of meeting server are, for example, of course, audio conferencing, video conferencing, web conferencing, meeting and recording, use the meeting application, as well as complementing existing infrastructure. Audio conferencing, which is used to reduce IT effort with a solution that integrates with your existing dial plan. So the idea is that how easy you can initiate a audio conference based on your existing dial plan without having a complex system. Now, it does give the users the flexibility to join multiple ways to join a conference. Allows you to initiate a DTMF and IVR functionality as well. It manages the return of investment with the detailed reporting. Now, it does support the standard codec, for example, G711, 22, G729, Opus, as well as AAC-LD codec is supported within the audio conferencing. Whereas a video conference, of course, if you like to establish a video, it will initiate a video conference as well. It allows you to make the meeting a bit more, more realistic, more visual, and more fun, I guess. You know, for some people, they prefer to see the person that they're talking to. Now, it does make experience work for you, the flexible layout and controls. It does support following video codecs, which are pretty much standard in most cases. It also supports Microsoft RTP codec as well. Web conference, which allows you to attend meeting on the move, especially from your mobile browser or different web browsers, or it could be your customized app. So it allows you to participate in audio and a video, and as well as content sharing, so that you can see the screen and whiteboard, whatnot. It does maintain security with the guest access or user login. Now, meeting and recording. When you are in a meeting using your Cisco Meeting application, you have the options to record your meeting by pressing a little record buttons, of course, which allows you to record button right here, and that's an indication that the meeting is being recorded. Now, of course, if you do record the meeting, there gotta be a way to store them, and you can use any network file system to store all your video MP4 files. Now, Cisco Meeting App, which is basically an application of client designed by Cisco, which is basically provide exceptional high video quality, consistent user experience, persistence, chat, and presence, which saves information. It has the end user capability to change the layout should they need to, send invite message, invite to join a conference, allows you to create your own space or team, basically like your own meeting room, and device mobility and flexibility. Now, this is a client software that you must install on your laptop, either Windows or I believe Mac as well supported. Now, one of the important thing about meeting server, it is highly encrypted system. That means it must have various certificate that it needs in order to communicate and establish a communication. So let me walk you through a little bit about what is authentication encryption. Now, encryption, there are two types of encryption are supported: asymmetric, and asymmetric, where you will encrypt using a key, and then, of course, when the other party receives a call or message, they will decrypt using a specific key to ensure that the message has not been tampered with. Now, the same key, if you're using an asymmetric encryption, where when you encrypt a message using a particular key, same key will be used by the recipient to decrypt the message. In this scenario, encryption and decryption key is exactly the same. It's like having a duplicate key. Now, of course, this is faster for sending large amount of data, and key must be installed on both ends of the communication, because obviously the endpoint must have that, the recipient must have the key as well. Otherwise, they will not be able to decode the messages. Now, whereas asymmetric encryption, you have two set of keys. You got a public key, which are advertised to anyone, and private key, which are only known to device receiving the messages. Now, message encryption, messages are encrypted with a public key, which can, of course, then be decrypted only by the people who receives it. So basically what you do, you have a set of key, the private key, you give it to all the users who's going to receive your message. Now, every time you want to send a message to them, you will use your public key to encrypt the message, which goes to the recipient. Recipient then will use a corresponding private key to unencrypt or decrypt the messages. So this is basically how a certificate works. Now, that is for encryption. What about authentication? Now, authentication provides a proof that you are who you are. So the way we authenticate is by various different type of certificate. You have a CA certificate, which is your certificate of authority, which is used to validate the authenticity of any certificate authorized by the certificate of authority. Now, certificate of authority are a third-party company who issue certificates. Then, of course, you have a server certificate, which is used to validate a server. You have a client certificate that is used to validate the client side. And then you have a user certificate, which is used to allow devices to automatically log in and authenticate themselves. Now, certificate authority is basically provide background check of the company requesting the certificate. Issues server certificate and the client certificate as well. It also contains a maintain a list of certificate that has been expired or no longer valid. Now, their job is to, of course, when you go to a website like say www.google.com, you often see that little HTTPS on the top on the URL. Well, before the server is connected, what happened is your web browser is actually contacting the GoDaddy, for example, and trying to find out if the certificate of the Google is valid or not. And if it is valid, then it will initiate a communication. Certificate authority has their own certificate, which they can then use to issue certificate to their client. Now, certificate authority will issue their own certificate that contains a public key of the CA, commonly known as CA root certificate. Certificate authority will issue server and client certificate encrypted with the CS private key. So, for example, you want to purchase a certificate from GoDaddy, and you most of the web browser usually have most likely the private key of the GoDaddy in their web browser. So, certificate authority server will then issue a server and a client certificate, and they will encrypt that with the CS private key, which can, of course, be decrypted using the public key. To be able to trust the certificate published by CA, the CA root certificate must be loaded onto the device that is receiving the server certificate. So, what is a server certificate? Basically, it's a certificate that contains a serial number, the issuer, the valid date from when it's valid, the actual encryption key, the asymmetric key, the name of the company, like a subject, common name, company name, their location, and various other public key information. All these informations are encoded into this particular certificate that will be installed on the server side. Now, commercial certificate can be obtained from various third-party organizations, or you can become your own certificate server. Here's an example of Symantec providing certificate to client. You can actually purchase certificate from their website, or you can set up your own Microsoft certificate server and you become your own certificate authority as well. Now, keep in mind, not everyone is going to trust you, so therefore you must deal with that portion as well. Then you have self-signed certificate. So every time you install a server, they often install their own self-signed certificate, which is basically a device internal certificate issued by the internal CA. A certificate without CA, for example, a server A will generate own certificate and key pair, manually copy the server certificate and the public key to the second server. Server B now trusts server A, for example. However, it does not necessarily mean that server A trusts server B though. So you got to do the reverse as well. Now, the architecture for Cisco Meeting Server. Now, as I say, there are various components within the Cisco Meeting Server that are working together. You have the WebBridge, XMPP server, call bridge, database, and recording and streaming. Not all components will be installed in all servers, of course. Now, the topology is usually that you will have a client that are mostly outside, WebRTC client or Cisco Meeting App. You may have a firewall, and then you have the Expressway E. Now, this is an architecture called core and edge with a single edge solution. In your Expressway E, you have a web proxy traversal for the web proxy to work. If a customer wants to use a WebRTC, and then you have a turn server, which is basically called NAT traversal. We'll talk about that later. That allows you to connect to the internal core servers as well. And then, of course, you have your internal client there behind the firewall. The deployment and the lab topology that we're going to use is basically we'll have our own Expressway Edge, which has a turn server running. We will have client outside. We have a single meeting server gateway. We have one meeting server in our cluster. And then, of course, our internal call manager and video endpoint and a WebRTC client. So when we do the lab I'll show you how to configure each component individually. So the configuration task is that you follow certain steps in order to configure the system. You will first do some basic configuration on the CMS server, such as define your necessary certificate, upload them, download them to necessary server. For example, server A and server B, where you must trust the certificate. Create a database clustering, configure your web admin, define your call bridge if you are going to do web audio and video conferencing. If you have a Cisco Meeting App, meeting server application, you must configure the XMPP as well. Now, CMS API, of course, you need the web bridge and LDAP synchronization is required. Now, there is no local username and password in meeting server, so you should use an LDAP for authentication. You have dial plan to configure in CMS as well, both inbound and outbound. And of course, you can do ad-hoc conferencing with call manager by establishing or registering the meeting server as a conference bridge, for example. So these are the configuration tasks that we must follow. But how do we configure the system? Well, we can configure the system through CLI. You can configure through SSH, Web Console, VM Console as well. Or you can directly connect to web interface, where it allows you to create dial plan, call bridge, as well as administration of the system. You can use third-party API, which allows you to most configuration that is not in an MMP. So you can then use a third-party API to manage the system as well. Now, for licensing certificate backup upgrade, you must use SFTP for them to upgrade your system or backup your configs to a remote server. SFTP protocol will be used. The core certificate that are needed by most of the components will need certificate. So it is important that you plan your certificate in advance and ensure that they are combined where is possible. Certificate type that for example, self-signed certificate by CMS, private CA signed certificate, public CA signed certificate are allowed. If you are deploying high availability, so redundancy scalability has to be considered, which allows you to do increased capacity. It allows you to do a geographic optimization, resilience as well as failover. All these things can be a benefit to large organization. Now, other core components that can be deployed in multiple servers are, for example, WebBridge. can be deployed in a multiple server for load balancing and load distributions as well. You could do a database clustering, which provide more resilience. You can provide call bridge clustering, distribute calls for capacity and resiliency. You can also provide XMPP clustering as well. Now, Cisco Meeting Server Space, which basically provides, think about a space as like an area for your conference. So you want to have a space for yourself so that you can invite your own client or friends or colleague to do web conference. Usually you will create a personal URL like join.domain.com. You can use your own personal, sometimes you see this webex.com/Kathy, for example. So those type of stuff are created by adding space in your CMS server. It allows you to do scheduling. You can schedule a meeting through Telepresence Management Suite, or you can use Outlook integration or one button push to support as well. From a call manager perspective, you can set up ad hoc conferencing with call manager by registering the CMS as a conference bridge. Now, LDAP integration is required because there is no local users in CMS server except for the admin and API access. So LDAP mapping can create a personal space with either a primary and a secondary space and a user URI for connectivity. Now you have to keep in mind that it should not overlap with any other URI. So you do not want to create the same user with a multiple URI. Multiple LDAP sources is supported. For ad hoc conferencing in call manager, which is one-to-one call to add participant, it started support from CMS 2.0. In order to do that, you must create a SIP trunk between a call manager and CMS. Doesn't matter whether it's secure or not. And an API access is required as well, which is a connection from call manager to CMS web admin. Now, in order to do that, CM call manager server must trust the CMS web admin certificate in the call manager trust store, which again I will show you how to configure that. Dial plan is required for call processing. As a call coming in, CMS will always use domain-based routing to determine the call treatment. As the call coming in, all incoming call will first check if the call is for this particular CMS, if there is a space for that based on the URI, if the call is for Lync, so then it will forward the call to specific server, and if there is no match for the domain found, then the forwarding rules will be checked. The forwarding rules will check to see if the call should be forwarded at all and whether the domain is matched or not. If the domain is not matched, the call will be rejected. Outgoing call rules, where it will finally find the destination to decide where the call will go, do any transformation if it requires or if there is any, and of course it is use a standard based or linked trunk type to forward the call to the next hop. Now, one of the most important thing in CMS is of course call bridge, which is the component for meeting server that bridge the conference connection. It enables multiple participants to join meeting hosted on a meeting server or a Lync MCU. Call bridge exchange audio video stream so that the participant can see and hear each other. Whenever you're dealing with WebRTC application, which is basically used to receive and transmit high quality video using H.264, you must have a web bridge. And WebRTC application works on HTML5 compliant browser and use the WebRTC standard for video and audio calls. Now, we heard about this term a lot, turn server, which is basically provides a firewall traversal technology which allows the meeting server to be deployed behind a firewall on a NAT. Turn server listens on both port 443 and 3478 for both UDP and TCP connection. Media is sent over TCP using the TLS encryption. Turn servers support both TCP and UDP, TCP to UDP in internet working. So it allows you to convert from UDP to TCP. For example, here, as you can see, UDP are not allowed, but you can convert it to TCP as well if needed to be. So TCP traffic comes in and then it goes to UDP after getting converted. A browser can send a TCP multimedia to turn server, which will then convert to standard UDP media. And this is useful when UDP traffic from the browser is usually blocked. Now, the turn server in a combined server deployment must be configured to listen on the loopback interface. XMPP server, which is a server used by a Cisco Meeting application. So if you're going to use this application, you must have the XMPP license installed on that server. Now, XMPP license included in a meeting server software, of course. And if you it also need a call bridge activated on the same meeting server as XMPP server. So what does XMPP does? It handles signaling to and from the meeting app, including the WebRTC application as well. Database, which the call bridge will use to read and write from the database from storing the space information. For example, the members of the space, chat messages occur between the members of the space, and a recent activity within the space. So think about a space is like a group or a zone, like where you're a member of the zone, and then whatever you do, it will be stored in that particular space. Single combines deployment, the deployment model, the database is created and managed automatically by the call bridge and does not require any activation key. A SIP trunk and a routing. CMS requires a SIP trunk to be set up from one or more of the following devices: SIP control device and voice call control, and Lync front-end servers. Now, you can use a SIP trunk to communicate between these devices. Any changes to call routing configuration on these devices are required to route calls to meeting server that require the XMPP server or the web bridge services for interoperability. Cisco Meeting Server will support SIP and Lync call via the traversal of the local firewall. Now, not everybody uses Cisco Meeting Server. There are companies that use Microsoft Skype for conferencing solution as well. Now, the Skype for Business client, which is very popular among the Microsoft community. So if you want to set up a communication between your organization and your vendor, then you can use a Lync client integration with your meeting server. The meeting server will use RTV codec for transcoding 1080p with 2010 Lync Windows client and a 2011 Lync Mac client. H.264 codec will be used on 2013 Lync Windows client and Skype for Business client. Meeting server will provide both RTP and RTV and H.264 stream when mixture of client versions are connected. Now keep in mind, Skype for Business and Lync, certain version of Lync can support share content as well. The meeting server transcode the content from a native RDP, Lync RDP, into a video format used by other participants in a meeting and send it as a separate stream. So as I say that if you want to use this, then SIP call control will be required. Configuration changes to any route calls destined to the Skype for Business client, for example. In that scenario, is required so the SIP video endpoint can call the Skype endpoint as well. Recording and streaming of meeting. Recorder component on meeting server allows you to add the capability of recording meetings and saving the recording to a document, which allows you to store that document on a network file system. The streamer component adds the capability of streaming meeting held in a space to a URI configured on that space. any external streaming server needs to be configured to listen on that particular URI. Now, the external streaming server can offer live streaming to the users, or it can record a live streaming for later playback. So think about it as like a webinar concept, so that webinar is live sometime, or when the webinar is actually finished, the system will record that webinar and automatically stream back to the for live playback if needed as well. So these are the recording and streaming meeting capability. Alright, so that's pretty much the overview and introduction to Cisco Meeting Server. We are going to provide more details about the features chapters in terms of how to configure and the various components. So stay tuned and we'll see you soon.